long before the headlines, before the Nobel Prizes, before the textbook simplified everything into neat diagrams. There were quiet rooms filled with uncertainty, a candle burning late into the night, a notebook filled with crossed-out theories, a mind wrestling with doubt. America's greatest scientific discoveries did not begin with certainty. They began with curiosity, and they were carried forward by courage. The courage to be wrong, the courage to persist, the courage to question what everyone else accepted as truth. Tonight, we step away from the loud versions of history into the human moments behind the breakthroughs, the fragile beginnings, the private fears, the quiet determination. If you enjoy calm, thoughtful journeys into the hidden sides of history, consider subscribing to History for Sleep. We explore the slow stories behind the world you live in, gently, deeply, and without rush. Now, let's begin where all discovery begins, with a question. Before there were laboratories filled with polished steel and humming machines, before there were universities bearing famous names, before discoveries were simplified into diagrams and textbooks, there was a question. Not a loud one, not a triumphant declaration, just a quiet disturbance in the mind of someone who could not quite accept what everyone else seemed so certain about. Scientific revolutions rarely begin with answers. They begin with discomfort, with the subtle feeling that something about the world does not fully make sense, with the courage to whisper, even if only to oneself, what if we are wrong? For centuries, people believed that disease drifted through the air like a curse. Bad air, they called it. Miasma. Invisible vapors rising from swamps, from crowded streets, from the breath of cities themselves. The explanation was comforting in its simplicity. If sickness floated in foul-smelling air, then it made sense. Illness was unpleasant, and so was stench. The logic felt complete. But somewhere, in a small room, perhaps beside a window slightly cracked open to let in light, someone stared at the pattern of infection and felt unsettled. Why did some fall ill while others standing in the same air did not? Why did outbreaks cluster around water sources? Why did washing hands seem in certain cases to matter? The question formed quietly. What if disease is not caused by bad air? It was not shouted in public squares. It was not immediately embraced. It was scribbled into notebooks. It was tested in small, careful observations. It required a peculiar kind of courage. The courage not to accept the comfort of consensus. The courage not to accept the comfort of consensus, to question prevailing belief, is not merely intellectual, it is social. It is emotional. It risks isolation. When everyone around you nods in agreement at an explanation, to tilt your head and ask, "But what if?" is to step slightly outside the circle. Curiosity, in this way, becomes a quiet rebellion. The rebellion does not always look dramatic. There are no raised fists. There are no slogans. Instead, there is patience. There is the steady recording of data, the washing of hands again and again, even when colleagues mock the habit. The tracing of water pumps on a map while others wave away the effort is unnecessary. The power of a question lies in its refusal to remain still. Once asked, it lingers. It hovers at the edge of every observation. It changes the way the world is seen. And this pattern repeats throughout history. Imagine another question, forming in a different era, under a different sky. For generations, the heavens were fixed and distant. The stars were lights beyond reach. The moon, a silent ornament. Space was not a destination. It was a ceiling, a boundary, a limit. And yet, someone looked upward and did not see a boundary. They saw distance. And distance, unlike a wall, can be crossed. What if space isn't unreachable, died? It sounds almost naive now. In an age when satellites circle the planet and rockets rise in arcs of flame. But there was a time when such a thought bordered on fantasy. To suggest that humans could leave the ground was to invite ridicule. Gravity was absolute. The sky was untouchable. But curiosity does not measure itself against tradition. It measures itself against possibility. In quiet workshops and early laboratories, calculations began to form. Equations written in chalk. Sketches of engines and fuels. The math did not laugh. The physics did not mock. The laws of motion, carefully studied, hinted that escape from Earth was not forbidden. It was merely difficult. The question did not demand immediate triumph. It demanded persistence. Curiosity often begins where practicality ends. It asks, even when the answer seems impossibly far away, what if the sky is not a ceiling, but a path? The courage required here is subtle, but immense. It is the courage to dedicate a life to something that may not succeed within that lifetime. It is the willingness to endure decades of incremental progress. Small improvements in propulsion, slightly better materials, tiny refinements in design. Each step forward is almost invisible, but together they reshape destiny. And then there is electricity. For much of human history, lightning was divine spectacle, a flash in the sky, a crack of thunder, something to be feared or revered, but not understood. Electricity flickered in nature, unpredictable and wild. Static shocks from wool and fur were curiosities, not tools. The idea that this force, this invisible energy, could be harnessed, directed, controlled, seemed almost arrogant. But somewhere, someone felt that familiar discomfort. If lightning follows patterns, if sparks can be drawn from certain materials, if currents move in predictable ways, what if electricity can be controlled? Die again. The question did not arrive with applause. It arrived with experiment, with kites lifted into stormy skies, with wires coiled and uncoiled, with careful observation of attraction and repulsion. Curiosity here is not reckless. It is methodical. It watches. It repeats. It adjusts. To control electricity was not merely to create light. It was to reimagine civilization. But the first person to ask the question did not know the scale of its future impact. They simply felt compelled to understand. This is the nature of scientific revolution. It rarely feels revolutionary at the start. It feels like confusion. It feels like noticing something small that does not fit. It feels like restlessness. There is a kind of bravery in accepting the unknown. Many people prefer certainty, even flawed certainty, to ambiguity. Certainty provides comfort. It tells us the world is stable and understandable. But curiosity thrives in uncertainty. It says, perhaps our understanding is incomplete. This statement can be threatening. Institutions are built on accepted truths. Careers depend on established theories. Entire systems of education reinforce prevailing explanations. To ask a foundational question is to gently tug at the threads of those systems, and yet progress depends on it. Consider the emotional landscape of the one who asks. They may not be dramatic figures. They may not appear rebellious in personality. Often they are quiet, observant, patient. Their rebellion is not loud. It is persistent. They notice inconsistencies others overlook. They feel unsettled by easy answers. They are willing to sit with doubt longer than most. The power of a question is not just in the challenge it poses to the world. It is in the transformation it creates within the one who asks it. Once you begin to question, you cannot fully return to passive acceptance. The world becomes layered, complex, alive with possibility. In the case of disease, the shift from bad air to microscopic organisms required a complete reorientation of perception. It required imagining life too small to see. It required trusting evidence that contradicted centuries of belief. In the case of space, it required redefining humanity's place in the universe. No longer earthbound creatures confined by gravity, but potential travelers. In the case of electricity, it required seeing energy not as chaos, but a system. Each of these began with discomfort, and discomfort is rarely celebrated. We often celebrate discovery at the moment of success, the rocket launch, the glowing light bulb, the cured infection. But the real turning point happens earlier, in silence. It happens when someone sits with an uneasy thought and does not dismiss it. What if there is another explanation? What if the pattern we see is incomplete? What if the limit we accept is not absolute? Curiosity is sometimes mistaken for restlessness, but in truth it is attentiveness. It is the refusal to let anomalies slide past unnoticed. It is looking at a crowded hospital ward and wondering why certain neighborhoods suffer more. It is staring at the moon and wondering whether the distance is mathematical rather than mystical. It is feeling a static spark and wondering whether that spark follows rules. There is something deeply human in this process. Children ask questions. Instinctively, they ask why the sky is blue, why birds fly, why shadows move. Over time, many of those questions fade under the weight of routine and responsibility. The world becomes familiar, the explanations we are given become sufficient. But scientists, those who drive revolutions, retain a fragment of that childhood wonder, not the loud curiosity of play, but the quiet curiosity of observation. They do not accept because it has always been that way as a final answer, and yet the act of questioning can feel isolating. When prevailing wisdom is deeply embedded, to challenge it can invite resistance. People may feel threatened, not because the question is hostile, but because it introduces instability. If disease is not caused by bad air, then sanitation systems must change, medical training must change, public policy must change. If space is reachable, then national priorities must shift, resources must be allocated, new risks must be accepted. If electricity can be controlled, entire industries may be born and others rendered obsolete. Questions ripple outward. They disturb the surface of certainty, but they also illuminate. The person who asks does not always foresee the ripple. Often, they are simply compelled by the desire to understand. There is humility in this pursuit. True curiosity acknowledges it admits, we do not yet know. This admission requires courage. It is easier to defend established beliefs than to admit gaps in knowledge. It is easier to say this is the way it is than to say, I am not sure. Scientific revolutions depend on individuals who are comfortable saying, I am not sure, and then continuing anyway. The power of a question lies in its simplicity. It does not demand immediate answers. It invites exploration. What if disease is not caused by bad air? This question opens the door to microscopes, to germs that tide, eerie to antiseptics to vaccines. What if space isn't unreachable? This question leads to rocketry, to orbital mechanics, to satellites, to footprints on distant surfaces. What if electricity can be controlled? This question unfolds into power grids, communication systems, digital networks. But at the beginning, none of this is visible. At the beginning, there is only doubt, and doubt, when guided by careful observation, becomes discovery. There is a rhythm to this process: observation, discomfort, question, experiment, failure, refinement, and sometimes, slowly, revelation. The revelation is rarely explosive. More often it is quiet, a result repeats, a pattern holds, a hypothesis survives scrutiny. The world shifts almost imperceptibly at first. In hindsight, revolutions appear inevitable. Of course, disease is caused by microbes. Of course, humans can reach space. Of course, electricity can be harnessed. But inevitability is an illusion created by memory. At the moment of questioning, nothing is guaranteed. The courage required is not certainty of success, but willingness to explore uncertainty. And this courage is available to anyone who is willing to look closely. The power of a question is democratic. It does not require authority. It requires attention. To sit with a problem and ask, gently, persistently, what if there is more to understand? In this way, curiosity becomes a form of hope. Hope that the world is intelligible. Hope that problems have solutions. Hope that limits are not always permanent. The history of scientific revolution is not merely a history of inventions. It is a history of questions that refused to be silenced. Questions that lingered in the minds of those who could not ignore them. Questions that began as quiet rebellions against easy answers. And perhaps tonight, as you listen, you may feel that same gentle stirring of curiosity, a small question about something ordinary, something familiar, something taken for granted. You may not need to build a rocket, or discover a microbe, or harness lightning. But the spirit that reshapes the world begins in the same place, with a simple, Uncomfortable thought. What if, long before the laboratory, there is usually a child, not yet aware of the word discovery. Just a child standing in a backyard, or leaning over a creek, or staring through a bedroom window at the night sky, with a feeling that is difficult to name. For many of America's most influential scientific minds, the early signs were not dramatic. They did not announce themselves as future pioneers. They appeared as habits, as quiet fascinations, as questions that returned again and again long after other children had moved on to something else. A child kneels in the grass and does not simply see grass. He sees movement, ants tracing invisible highways between crumbs and soil. He watches them longer than expected, long enough for other children to lose interest. He wonders how they know where to go. He wonders whether they speak somehow, without sound. He feels a small stirring of mystery, not frightening but absorbing. Another child dismantles a household clock, not out of destruction but longing. She wants to know what makes it tick. The rhythm is steady and dependable, but what produces it? She spreads the gears across the floor, studying their shapes. Her parents may see mess. She sees pattern, the tiny teeth interlocking in precise order, the movement that travels from one piece to the next. In another place, under a sky unpolluted by city lights, a child lies on his back in the dark. The stars seem fixed and silent, but he feels something in their stillness. They do not look random. They form shapes. They move slowly over months. He begins to notice patterns in their rising and setting. He does not yet have equations. He has only attention. These early fascinations are rarely loud. They do not demand applause. They grow in private moments. In bedrooms cluttered with jars of insects. In garages filled with wires and batteries. In notebooks filled with awkward sketches of plants or planets. Childhood curiosity often carries a tone of solitude. Not necessarily loneliness in the painful sense, but separation. The child who lingers over a beetle while others run toward a game of tag may feel slightly apart. The child who asks why the moon changes shape may find that adults answer quickly and move on. The question remains. Many future scientists describe a sense of being slightly out of rhythm with their surroundings. Not unhappy. Not alienated in a dramatic way. Simply tuned to something quieter. While others respond to immediate excitement, they respond to subtlety. A leaf turning color. A magnet pulling a nail. A spark jumping between metal points. There is wonder in these moments, but also intensity. The kind of focus that narrows the world down to a single phenomenon. Wonder, in childhood, can feel almost sacred. The first time a child peers through a simple telescope and sees the craters of the moon, the experience can be transformative. The moon is no longer a flat disk. It is textured, scarred, real. The realization that something distant can be examined closely creates a shift in perception. The world feels larger and more accessible at the same time. Insects, too, have drawn young minds into quiet obsession. The symmetrical wings of a butterfly, the segmented body of a beetle, the way a spider constructs its web with patient precision. Some children collect these creatures in jars, not out of cruelty, but fascination. They want to observe, to classify, to understand. Parents may worry, teachers may gently redirect, but the fascination persists. There is a tenderness in these early obsessions. They are not yet tied to achievement or recognition. They are fueled by pure curiosity, a desire to know how something works, why something behaves as it does. Chemistry often begins with color. The way two liquids mix and produce something unexpected. The fizz of a simple reaction, the transformation of clear solutions into bright hues. For a child, this feels like magic, but with rules. Repeatable magic. Predictable magic. Predictable magic. And in that predictability lies comfort. The world, which can feel chaotic and overwhelming, reveals pockets of order. Patterns emerge. Cause and effect become visible. A small experiment produces the same result again and again. There is stability in that repetition. For some children, curiosity becomes a refuge. The social world of childhood can be confusing. Emotions are strong and not always explained. Rules change depending on context. Friendships shift, but a mechanical system does not change its behavior based on mood. A chemical reaction does not alter itself out of spite. The stars do not rearrange themselves because of gossip. There is reliability in nature, and so, the child who feels slightly out of place socially may feel deeply at home with systems. This does not mean all scientists were isolated or withdrawn, but many experience periods of intense inward focus. Hours spent alone reading about electricity, afternoons building simple radios, evenings copying diagrams from books about anatomy or astronomy. Isolation, in this sense, is not purely negative. It creates space for depth. Depth requires time. While other children skim across interests, the future scientist may dive. They read beyond their age level. They memorize facts not for praise, but because the information, fetid eels, satisfying. It completes a picture. Sometimes teachers recognize this spark. A science fair project that goes beyond expectations, a question in class that catches others off guard, a homemade contraption that nearly works. Sometimes the curiosity goes unnoticed. The child works quietly, experiments fail in private, circuits short out, collections of rocks fill drawers. The fascination remains internal, almost secret. There can be frustration in this stage. The gap between understanding and knowledge feels wide. The child senses that there is more to learn, but does not yet have the tools. They read about atoms and imagine them as tiny solar systems. They learn about gravity and feel its pull on every jump. The emotional tone here is complex. There is wonder, certainly, the wide-eyed amazement at the complexity of a spider's web or the rings of Saturn. There is also obsession, the kind that leads a child to repeat the same experiment dozens of times, to stay up past bedtime reading about electricity, to fill margins with sketches of machines. And sometimes there is quiet loneliness. Not because they lack companionship, but because their intensity is not always shared. When a child wants to talk at length about the life cycle of cicadas or the mechanics of a combustion engine, peers may drift away. The conversation feels heavy to those who are not equally captivated. The young mind learns to balance this, to keep certain fascinations private, to retreat into books, to pursue curiosity without constant validation. This independence becomes foundational. Science requires the ability to persist without immediate reward. Childhood curiosity trains this muscle. The child who studies ants for hours does not receive applause. The child who disassembles a broken radio may not even succeed in reassembling it. That the act of trying builds resilience. There is something deeply human about the early signs. A fascination with stars often begins with darkness. The quiet of night, the absence of distraction. Looking upward invites contemplation. The vastness of the sky can evoke both insignificance and belonging. The child feels small, but also connected to something immense. That emotional mixture, humility and curiosity, often defines the scientific temperament. Mechanics often begin with touch, the weight of a tool, the click of a gear, the hum of a small motor. For some children, physical systems feel intuitive. They can sense how parts fit together. They imagine movement before it occurs. Nature, too, offers endless invitation. Leaves with intricate veins, rocks layered with history, water flowing around obstacles. Each element presents a puzzle. Why does this plant grow here and not there? Why does this rock sparkle? Why does the stream change course after a storm? These questions are not grand at first. They are small and local. But they cultivate a habit of attention. Attention is the seed of science. The emotional tone of young curiosity is often gentle but persistent. It is not always dramatic. It can be quiet and steady, like a background hum. Some children keep detailed journals long before anyone asks them to. They record bird sightings. They chart temperatures. They sketch constellations. The act of writing solidifies observation. It transforms fleeting interest into structured inquiry. There is also courage in this early stage, though it may not be recognized as such. To pursue an interest intensely, especially when it differs from peers, requires confidence, a willingness to be slightly different. To choose a book about chemistry over a popular trend, to spend weekends building a telescope rather than attending a party. This is not a rejection of society, but an alignment with inner curiosity. Obsess, science, in childhood can sometimes worry adults. The child who seems consumed by a single topic, who talks endlessly about insects or rockets. But within healthy boundaries, this obsession becomes focus, and focus becomes expertise. Many American scientists later reflected on childhood moments that felt small at the time but shaped their trajectory. A teacher who encouraged a science project, a library that provided access to advanced books, a parent who tolerated messy experiments in the kitchen. These influences do not create curiosity, but they protect it. Curiosity is delicate in childhood. It can be dismissed, laughed at, re-eyed at too forcefully, but when nurtured gently, it deepens. Isolation, too, can refine curiosity. The child who spends long hours alone develops internal dialogue. They think through problems, they imagine possibilities, they rehearse explanations in their mind. This interior life becomes a laboratory of thought. Insects become ecosystems. Stars become distant suns. Mechanical toys become models of larger systems. There is beauty in this stage, because it is unburdened by expectation. The child does not yet know about funding, peer review, or publication. They explore for the sake of exploration. The emotional tone oscillates between delight and frustration. Delight when a simple experiment works, when a homemade circuit lights a bulb, when a telescope reveals Jupiter's moons. Frustration when results fail, when explanations are incomplete, when books provide answers that raise even more questions, but the frustration does not extinguish the curiosity. It sharpens it. In some cases, the child feels misunderstood, their intensity mistaken for distraction, their questions brushed aside. This can produce a quiet determination, a resolve to find answers independently. This independence is powerful. Scientific revolutions often require individuals who can withstand skepticism. Childhood curiosity, when pursued despite indifference, builds that resilience. Wonder remains central. The first time a child sees a chemical reaction change color, it feels transformative. Matter is not static, it transforms. The first time a magnet repels another magnet without touching, it feels mysterious. Forces exist beyond sight. These experiences create a sense of hidden layers. The world is not merely what it appears to be. There are invisible currents, microscopic organisms, distant galaxies, subatomic particles. The child senses that reality is deeper than surface perception, and that depth calls to them. Over time, curiosity becomes identity. The child is the one who likes science, the one who collects rocks, the one who reads about stars. This label can both isolate and empower. It sets them apart, but it also affirms their passion. Obsession, in its healthiest form, is sustained attention. It is the willingness to return to the same question repeatedly, to refine understanding slowly, to tolerate complexity. In the quiet of childhood bedrooms and backyards, these traits begin to form. They are not yet polished. They are messy and imperfect. Experiments spill. Calculations are wrong. Telescopes wobble. But the pattern is clear. Fascination with mechanics. Fascination with stars. Fascination with chemistry. And beneath it all, a steady emotional current of wonder. Wonder that does not fade with repetition, but deepens. Isolation that does not diminish enthusiasm, but protects it. Obsession that does not consume recklessly, but focuses gently. These early signs are rarely dramatic enough to predict greatness, but they create foundation. They teach patience. They cultivate observation. They reward persistence. They build comfort with solitude. They encourage questioning. Long before awards or recognition, before laboratories or institutions, There is simply a child looking closely at the world, noticing what others overlook, asking why when others accept, lingering when others move on, and in that lingering and that quiet devotion to understanding, the first seeds of scientific revolution are planted. Not in grand declarations, but in small private moments of curiosity that refuse to fade. Long before recognition, there is repetition, not the repetition of applause or interviews or polished lectures, but the quieter repetition of attempts. The same experiment assembled again, the same measurements taken under slightly altered conditions, the same notes rewritten in the margins of a notebook owl, 80 crowded with revisions. Failure in the life of a scientist is rarely theatrical. It does not always arrive with explosions or public humiliation. More often it arrives softly, a result that does not match expectation, a reaction that produces nothing, a device that hums but does not function, a calculation that collapses under closer scrutiny. It is in these moments, far from fame, that resilience begins to form. A laboratory can be a humble space, a wooden table scarred by acid stains, shelves lined with glassware clouded by repeated heating and cooling, wires tangled in careful disorder, the air thick with the scent of chemicals or warm metal. In such a room, a scientist may perform the same procedure dozens of times, adjusting temperature by a fraction, altering pressure slightly, changing the purity of a compound, each time hoping for clarity. Each time often receiving silence. The public rarely sees this stage. History remembers the breakthrough, not the hundreds of failed attempts that preceded it. But the failed attempts are not meaningless. They narrow the field of possibility. They teach what does not work. They refine technique. They demand patience. Sometimes failure is more visible. A lab accident. A fire sparked by unstable chemicals. A prototype overheating and collapsing. Glass shattered across the floor. Months of work reduced to debris in minutes. In such moments, it would be easy to step away. The mind may whisper that the idea was flawed from the beginning, that resources have been wasted, that time could be better spent elsewhere, orders new materials, rebuilds the apparatus piece by piece, adjusts safety precautions, revisits calculations. There is something deeply humbling about repeated failure. It erodes arrogance. It forces attention to detail. It teaches respect for complexity. In early experiments with electricity, wires burned out unexpectedly. Currents behaved unpredictably. Insulation failed. Theoretical models proved incomplete. But instead of abandoning the effort, researchers traced the faults. They mapped the behavior of current under different conditions. They learned from the scorch marks. Failure becomes data. Not a verdict on intelligence, but information about reality. Rejection, too, plays its role. A paper submitted to a respected journal returns with criticism. The language may be formal, but the message is clear. The evidence is insufficient. The methodology is flawed. The conclusion is premature. For a moment, discouragement settles in. Years of careful work distilled into paragraphs of doubt. Yet within the critique lies opportunity. The comments highlight weaknesses. They suggest refinements. They challenge assumptions that may have gone unnoticed. Class-eyed, weaknesses. The scientist revises, expands the data set, tightens the argument, clarifies ambiguous sections, submits again. Sometimes rejection repeats. The public, meanwhile, may remain unaware, or worse, skeptical. When a new idea challenges established belief, resistance is common. Colleagues may question motives. Institutions may hesitate to provide funding. Newspapers may frame the research as speculative or misguided. Public skepticism can sting, especially when the work is misunderstood. But patience requires separation between ego and inquiry. The goal is not immediate approval. The goal is understanding. Consider the emotional landscape of repeated failure. There are evenings when the lab is quiet except for the ticking of a clock. Notes spread across a desk reveal inconsistencies. Hypotheses that once felt elegant now appear incomplete. The temptation to simplify conclusions arises, but integrity demands caution. Patience in this context is not passive waiting. It is active endurance. It is the discipline to continue refining methods even when results are slow. Resilience is built in increments. A failed experiment teaches precision. A burned circuit teaches respect for voltage limits. A rejected paper teaches clarity of expression. There are moments of self-doubt, questions about competence, about whether the problem is solvable at all. But over time, the focus shifts from personal inadequacy to structural complexity. The problem is difficult not because the scientist is incapable, but because reality is intricate. This realization softens frustration. It transforms failure from personal defeat into collaborative negotiation with nature. Sometimes experiments fail for reasons invisible at first glance. Impurities in materials, tiny fluctuations in temperature, unnoticed biases in measurement. Identifying these variables requires meticulous review. The scientist retraces steps, recalculates, repeats procedures slowly, observing each stage with heightened attention. There is a rhythm to this process: attempt, observe, adjust, repeat. The rhythm can span years. During early research into disease transmission, experiments sometimes produced contradictory results. One batch of samples showed infection patterns, another did not. Contamination obscured findings. Instruments lacked precision, but instead of abandoning inquiry, researchers refined sterilization methods, improved microscopes, standardized procedures. The repeated failures guided improvement. Burned labs have marked scientific history more than once. Chemical reactions underestimated in volatility. Equipment pushed beyond safe limits. Accidents that damaged property and threatened lives. These events are sobering. They remind researchers that curiosity must be paired with caution. Ambition must respect physical law. After such incidents, rebuilding is both literal and emotional. Trust in equipment must be restored. Confidence must be recalibrated. Safety protocols rewritten. The rebuilding process demands patience. There is paperwork, funding applications, negotiations, with institutions wary of risk. Resilience here includes diplomacy, explaining why the work remains valuable despite setbacks, demonstrating lessons learned, convincing supporters that progress requires perseverance. Rejection of ideas can be more painful than physical accidents. When a theory contradicts prevailing wisdom, the response can be dismissive. Critics may argue that the data are anomalies, that the interpretation is misguided. Presentations at conferences may be met with polite skepticism, questions that imply doubt rather than curiosity. In such environments, resilience requires emotional steadiness. The ability to listen without defensiveness, to extract useful critique from dismissive tone, to return to the lab and test assumptions more rigorously. Patience also involves timing. Some ideas require the right technological context to succeed. Early attempts at certain experiments failed not because the hypothesis was wrong, but because instruments lacked sensitivity. The concept had to wait for better tools. During this waiting period, the researcher may feel suspended. The question remains compelling, but progress stalls. Resilience in these moments is subtle. It involves maintaining interest without immediate reward, continuing to read, to think, to refine theoretical frameworks. Failure before fame often unfolds quietly in obscurity. Colleagues pursue more fashionable topics. Funding agencies prioritize trends. The persistent researcher may feel unfashionable, out of step. Yet patience allows depth to accumulate. Years of data collected careful. Lie anomalies cataloged rather than ignored. Patterns emerging slowly from noise. When eventual success arrives, it appears sudden to outsiders. A breakthrough announced, a paper celebrated, an award granted. But beneath that moment lies a foundation of repeated attempts that did not work. There is humility in remembering this. Fame can distort narrative, creating the illusion of inevitability. But those who live through the failures understand how fragile progress felt. Each experiment that failed could have been the last attempt. Each rejection could have redirected a career. Resilience means choosing not to stop, choosing to believe that refinement will yield clarity. In mechanical innovation, prototypes often collapse, early models wobble over heat, or fracture under stress. Engineers study these breakdowns closely. The point of failure reveals weaknesses in design. Instead of discarding the project, they reinforce joints, adjust materials, rebalance weight distribution. The cycle repeats. With each iteration, the device becomes sturdier. Scientific research mirrors this process. Hypotheses are prototypes of understanding. Experiments stress test them. Weaknesses emerge. Revisions follow. Sometimes failure is cumulative. Years of work led to a conclusion that does not support the original hypothesis. The data contradict expectations. The theory must be abandoned. Letting go of an idea cultivated over years can feel like loss, but integrity demands alignment with evidence. The scientist adjusts course. New questions emerge from old disappointments. Public skepticism can intensify during controversial research. Media narratives may oversimplify. Critics may amplify doubts. Funding may waver. In such climates, patience requires restraint, responding calmly, providing data rather than rhetoric. Allowing evidence to accumulate over time. Time is often the ally of resilient inquiry. Initial rejection may transform into acceptance as replication confirms findings. Skeptics may become collaborators when results persist. The journey from failure to recognition is rarely linear. There are plateaus, periods when progress stalls, moments when enthusiasm wanes. During these times, routine sustains effort. Reviewing notes, calibrating instruments, running controls. Routine may seem mundane, but it builds momentum. Failure before fame also includes personal sacrifice. Long hours away from family, financial uncertainty when grants are denied. The emotional toll of repeated disappointment. Yet resilience does not mean absence of discouragement. It means continuing despite it. Taking a walk to clear the mind. Discussing challenges with trusted colleagues. Returning to the work with renewed focus. Over time, failure becomes less threatening. It is expected, integrated into process. The scientist no longer interprets a failed experiment as catastrophe, but as information, a signal that refinement is needed. There is quiet strength in this perspective. It transforms frustration into curiosity. Why did this not work, Ivid? What variable was overlooked? What assumption requires testing? Burned labs can be rebuilt. Rejected papers can be revised. Skepticism can be addressed with evidence. The common thread is patience. Patience that extends beyond weeks or months into years. Patience that accepts incremental progress. Resilience that understands that discovery is rarely a straight path. In the early days of many major breakthroughs, isolation accompanied failure. Support networks were small, recognition absent, but small successes punctuated the discouragement. A result that aligns with prediction. A colleague who expresses arist. A revised paper accepted after multiple attempts. These moments sustain motivation. They remind the researcher that progress, though slow, is real. Failure before fame shapes character. It tempers ambition with humility. It teaches the value of thoroughness. It strengthens resolve. By the time recognition arrives, the scientist has already endured cycles of doubt and renewal. Fame becomes secondary to understanding. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath every celebrated discovery. Before the spotlight, there were dim rooms lit by desk lamps. Before applause, there were stacks of rejected drafts. Before success, there were experiments that yielded nothing. And through it all, there was persistence. Not loud, not dramatic, just the steady decision to try again. Discovery is often imagined as a triumphant moment, a realization so bright it dissolves all uncertainty. But long before recognition, before validation, before others begin to understand, there is a quieter reality. The loneliness of seeing something that others do not yet see. To be intellectually ahead of one's time is not immediately glorious. It is disorienting. It can feel like standing on a shoreline, watching a distant shape on the horizon that no one else acknowledges. You point toward it gently, describe its outline, explain its movement, but those around you see only open water. The long nights begin there. A desk lit by a single lamp, papers spread in uneven stacks, calculations revisited again and again, a mind turning over the same idea, refining it, testing it internally before daring to present it aloud. Outside the window, the world rests. Inside, thought continues. There is a particular silence that accompanies unconventional thinking, not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence. Few people to discuss the idea with. Few who are willing to entertain it. Serio, sly. Conversations drift back to accepted models, established explanations, comfortable certainties. The scientist returns home, carrying a theory that feels fragile. It is not yet strong enough to withstand ridicule. It must be nurtured carefully, examined privately. Doubt creeps in during these hours. Not always doubt about the data, but doubt about interpretation, about timing, about whether the idea is too radical, too early, too strange. Being ahead of one's time often means existing in a space between worlds. The old explanations no longer satisfy. The new framework has not yet been accepted. This in-between space can feel isolating. Colleagues may smile politely while quietly dismissing the proposal. Friends may change the subject when discussions become too abstract. Family members may encourage safer pursuits, less controversial paths. The social cost of unconventional thinking is rarely immediate rejection. More often, it is subtle distance. Invitations decline. Professional opportunities narrow. Funding becomes difficult to secure. The reputation of being difficult or obsessed begins to circulate quietly, and yet, the idea persists. During the long nights, the mind revisits the evidence, replays conversations, imagines counter-arguments, anticipates criticism, revises explanations in advance. The intellectual ahead of its time thinker lives in constant rehearsal, preparing to defend what few are ready to hear. Sleep can become elusive. Not because of anxiety alone, but because of intensity. The idea refuses to settle. It grows clearer with each mental pass. Connections appear between previously unrelated observations. Patterns align in new configurations. There is beauty in the solitude, but also weight. To see something new is exhilarating. To carry that vision alone is exhausting. Sometimes the loneliness is geographic. A scientist working far from major institutions, limited access to peers who might understand. Letters sent slowly awaiting responses that may take months. Feedback delayed, conversation fragmented. Other times the loneliness exists even in crowded rooms. Presenting a paper to an audience that listens without comprehension. Watching polite nods mask confusion or skepticism. Leaving the podium with applause that feels hollow. Intellectual isolation differs from emotional loneliness, yet they intertwine. The inability to share one's deepest thoughts creates distance. Conversations remain surface level. The most compelling part of one's life, the unfolding idea, remains partially hidden. There is also fear, not necessarily fear of being wrong, though that exists, but fear of being dismissed prematurely. If the idea is rejected too quickly, it may never receive the careful consideration it deserves. This fear encourages caution. Words are chosen carefully, evidence compiled meticulously. The scientist becomes both advocate and protector of the idea. Doubt intensifies in solitude. Without reinforcement from peers, the mind questions itself. What if the pattern is coincidence? What if the interpretation is flawed? What if the established theory is correct and I have overlooked something simple? These doubts are not weaknesses. They are essential components of rigorous thinking, but when carried alone, they grow heavier. There are moments, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the weight feels almost unbearable, when the distance between insight and acceptance seems vast, when the temptation to abandon the unconventional path arises. It would be easier to adjust the theory slightly, to align it more closely with prevailing views, to soften its edges until it becomes palatable. But true discovery often requires resistance to that temptation. The social cost of unconventional thinking can manifest in subtle career consequences. Grants denied because reviewers are uncertain. Promotions delayed because work appears speculative. Invitations to collaborate withdrawn due to perceived controversy. These experiences compound the loneliness. One begins to feel not only misunderstood, but professionally vulnerable, and yet, within that vulnerability lies a quiet strength. To persist despite skepticism requires deep conviction, not blind certainty, but trust in the evidence gathered, trust in careful reasoning, trust that clarity will emerge over time. The long nights become ritual, a time of solitude not entirely unwelcome. Without distraction, the idea can stretch fully. The mind can wander through possibilities without interruption. In those hours, breakthroughs often refine themselves. Connections become sharper, explanations more coherent. Weak points identified and strengthened. Solitude, though painful, provides space for depth. But there is a difference between chosen solitude and imposed isolation. When colleagues distance themselves, when conversations become strained, when reputations are questioned, the isolation feels imposed. It carries a sting. Some cope by narrowing their circle, sharing thoughts only with a trusted few. Others withdraw further, channeling energy entirely into work. Where there is a quiet discipline required to maintain emotional balance in such circumstances, to avoid bitterness, to resist resentment, to focus on the integrity of inquiry rather than the reactions of others. Intellectual pioneers often walk ahead of collective readiness. Their ideas require cultural shifts that have not yet occurred, technological tools that are not yet refined, conceptual frameworks that have not yet formed. This temporal misalignment intensifies loneliness. To see a future possibility, while living in a present unprepared for it, is to inhabit a kind of time gap. The mind races forward while the world remains anchored. Conversations can feel repetitive. The same objections raised again and again, the same misunderstandings clarified repeatedly. Patience becomes not just a virtue, but a necessity. There is also the emotional strain of defending one's work publicly, while wrestling with private uncertainty. Outwardly confident presentations may conceal inward questioning. The performance of certainty can be draining, and yet authenticity demands honesty about limitations, about unanswered questions, about the need for further testing. Balancing confidence and humility becomes an art. Aloneness of discovery is not always permanent. Over time, evidence accumulates, replications confirm findings. Younger thinkers, less attached to established models, show interest. But during the early stages, when acceptance is scarce, resilience is tested deeply. Relationships can strain under unconventional pursuits. Loved ones may worry about financial stability. Friends may struggle to relate to abstract preoccupations. Social gatherings may feel superficial compared to the intensity of research. The scientist learns to compartmentalize, to engage socially while carrying an internal narrative that few share. Yet even in loneliness, there is purpose. The knowledge that one is pursuing truth, however uncertain, provides grounding. The work becomes its own companion. The problem itself feels alive, responsive, evolving with each new insight. There are moments of quiet joy amid isolation. When a calculation aligns perfectly, when an experiment produces a consistent pattern, when a theoretical model suddenly explains disparate observations elegantly. These moments feel intimate, private victories witnessed only by the thinker in their notes. They provide fuel for continuation. Loneliness also sharpens clarity. Without constant validation, ideas must withstand internal scrutiny. Weak arguments collapse quickly under solitary examination. Strong ones endure. In this way, isolation refines discovery. But refinement does not erase longing for understanding. The desire to share insight, to see recognition in another's eyes, remains powerful. When that recognition finally arrives, perhaps in a single colleague who truly grasps the significance, it feels profound, A bridge forms across isolation. Until then, endurance is key. The social cost of unconventional thinking can include mischaracterization, being labeled stubborn, eccentric, impractical. These labels can wound even when worn lightly. The scientist must differentiate between useful critique and mere resistance to change. Learning this distinction takes time. There is also the awareness that history may not vindicate the idea, that it may remain marginal, that years of work may fade into obscurity. Accepting this possibility requires humility. The pursuit of discovery cannot depend entirely on recognition. It must be rooted in curiosity itself. The long nights continue regardless of outcome. Lamplight reflecting off scattered papers, margins filled with annotations, diagrams redrawn, hypotheses restructured. Outside, the world sleeps. Inside, the mind remains awake, reaching forward. There is a quiet nobility in this persistence. To think differently, to question established norms, to hold an idea gently but firmly while it matures, this is not glamorous work. It is slow, often thankless, frequently misunderstood, but it is essential. Every major shift in understanding began as a solitary conviction in someone's mind, an insight carried alone before it was shared widely. The loneliness of discovery is therefore not a flaw in the process, but part of it. It protects fragile ideas during their infancy. It forces careful articulation. It strengthens resolve. And though it may feel heavy, it is also a testament to courage. To stand slightly apart from consensus, to endure doubt without surrendering inquiry, to continue refining thought in quiet rooms long after applause would have been easier elsewhere. Eventually, some ideas find resonance, others remain seeds for future generations. But in every case, the emotional journey of being ahead of one's time shapes the thinker profoundly. They emerge tempered by isolation, grounded by doubt, strengthened by patience. The long nights do not vanish from memory. They become part of the story, not the celebrated part, but the foundational one. And within those nights, beneath the weight of solitude and skepticism, discovery continues quietly, waiting for the world to catch up. Every meaningful discovery, at some point in its early life, unsettles something. Not always dramatically, not with shouting or public scandal, but gently, like a shift in the foundation beneath a familiar building. Established beliefs tremble. Institutions hesitate. Conversations grow careful. Risk and resistance rarely appear as open battlefields. More often, they unfold in meeting rooms. In polite correspondence, in funding decisions quietly declined. When a new idea emerges, it does not arrive in a vacuum. It enters a landscape already shaped by accepted theories, professional hierarchies, political interests, and cultural expectations. To introduce something fundamentally new is to introduce instability, and instability makes people uneasy. Opposition from peers is often the first form of resistance. In conference halls and academic journals, ideas are measured against prevailing frameworks. A theory that diverges too sharply can feel threatening, not necessarily because it is wrong, but because it requires rethinking what others have spent careers building. Imagine presenting research that challenges a dominant model. The room listens attentively. Questions begin. Some are thoughtful and probing. Others carry subtle tension. Have you considered the established data from previous decades? Is it possible your methodology overlooked certain variables? Could your interpretation be influenced by selection bias? These questions are part of healthy scientific discourse, but when they accumulate around unconventional ideas, the tone can shift. Curiosity becomes guarded. Skepticism grows firm. Peers may not reject the idea outright. Instead, they may slow its progress, request additional studies, demand higher standards of proof, delay publication. For the researcher, this can feel like standing before a closed gate that opens only an inch at a time. Opposition does not always come from hostility. Often, it arises from caution. Established scientists have invested years into refining current models. They feel responsible for protecting intellectual rigor. A new idea must prove itself beyond doubt. But proving something new requires time and resources depend on funding. Funding struggles introduce another layer of risk. Grant proposals are written carefully, with clarity and precision. They outline hypotheses, methods, anticipated outcomes. Review panels evaluate them against criteria of feasibility and relevance. When research aligns with established priorities, support flows more easily. When it deviates, uncertainty arises. Is this too speculative? Is the potential impact worth the financial risk? Will this line of inquiry yield tangible results within the grant period? For unconventional thinkers, these questions become recurring obstacles. Proposals are returned with suggestions to narrow focus, to align more closely with current frameworks, to produce preliminary results before requesting full support. But preliminary results often require funding themselves. The cycle tightens. Quiet courage appears here, not in defiance but in persistence. The researcher revises the proposal, strengthens the rationale, gathers preliminary data through smaller, personal projects, seeks alternative sources of support. Sometimes this means working with limited equipment, sharing lab space, collaborating across institutions to pool resources. There is humility in adapting to constraints without abandoning the core idea. Public misunderstanding introduces another dimension of resistance. When discoveries touch on visible aspects of life, health, environment, technology, the public becomes involved. Media narratives can simplify complex findings into headlines. Nuance disappears. Doubt is amplified. Doubt is amplified. A discovery that challenges conventional wisdom may be portrayed as controversial, even dangerous. Talk shows invite debate before evidence is fully digested. Social opinion forms quickly, often without depth. For the scientist, this creates emotional strain. They did not pursue research to provoke fear or division. They sought understanding. Yet their work becomes a symbol in broader cultural conversations. Quiet courage here means restraint. Resisting the urge to respond defensively, explaining findings patiently, repeating clarifications without irritation, trusting that clarity will emerge over time. Political resistance can also surface when discoveries intersect with policy or economic interests. A new environmental finding may require regulatory change. A medical insight may disrupt existing pharmaceutical markets. A technological breakthrough may alter industry structures. Institutions that benefit from the status quo may resist change, not through overt hostility, but through delay. Through requests for further review, through calls for additional verification. Navigating this landscape requires diplomacy. The scientist must present evidence firmly but calmly. Avoid antagonizing stakeholders. Build alliances where possible. Communicate in language that bridges rather than divides. Opposition from peers can feel personal, even when it is not. A colleague who once offered friendly conversation may grow distant. Collaborative opportunities may fade. Invitations to speak may decrease. There is subtle social cost in being associated with controversial ideas, yet quiet courage does not demand confrontation. It does not seek to embarrass critics. Instead, it continues the work steadily, returning to the lab, running experiments, collecting data, publishing carefully constructed arguments. Over time, evidence accumulates, patterns strengthen. Replication by independent researchers reinforces credibility. Resistance begins to soften, not because of force, but because of persistence. Funding struggles teach resilience beyond intellectual capacity. They teach budgeting, negotiation, and compromise. They encourage creative problem-solving within constraints. Limited resources can sharpen focus, forcing prioritization of essential experiments. In some cases, researchers invest personal savings into early stages of their work. They sacrifice comfort to maintain momentum. This is not reckless ambition, it is measured commitment. They weigh risks carefully, Consider family responsibilities. Evaluate long-term sustainability. The decision to continue despite financial uncertainty reflects belief in the value of inquiry. Public misunderstanding can be emotionally taxing. Imagine reading headlines that misrepresent years of meticulous research, seeing simplified conclusions circulate widely, hearing one's work debated by individuals unfamiliar with its depth. There is temptation to retreat from public discourse entirely, to avoid interviews, to decline media engagement, but silence can allow misinformation to spread. So quiet courage steps forward gently, participating in interviews with patients, explaining complexities in accessible language, accepting that not every listener will be persuaded immediately. Social resistance can also emerge within institutions. Departments may hesitate to allocate space to unconventional projects. Tenure committees may question productivity if publications are delayed by rigorous verification. Administrative boards may prioritize safer investments. The researcher learns to advocate calmly, presenting data with clarity, highlighting long-term potential, building small successes that demonstrate viability. This advocacy is not dramatic protest. It is steady persuasion. There is dignity in this approach. It acknowledges the concerns of institutions while maintaining commitment to truth. Opposition from peers often evolves over time. Early skepticism may transform into cautious interest. A critic may become collaborator once evidence becomes undeniable. This transformation rarely occurs because of confrontation. It occurs because of consistency, because the researcher did not abandon the work under pressure, because results continued to appear, because patience outlasted doubt. Risk is inherent in discovery. Risk of professional isolation. Risk of financial instability. Risk of financial instability. Risk of public criticism. Yet without risk, innovation stalls. Quiet courage differs from bold rebellion. It does not seek headlines. It seeks understanding. It accepts that resistance is natural when change is proposed. It understands that skepticism is part of scientific rigor. The challenge lies in distinguishing between constructive skepticism and obstructive resistance. Constructive skepticism sharpens ideas. It demands better evidence. It improves methodology. Obstructive resistance dismisses prematurely. It protects comfort rather than truth. Navigating between these requires emotional intelligence, listening carefully, responding thoughtfully, maintaining composure when challenged. Funding struggles sometimes lead to unexpected collaboration. Researchers facing limited resources join forces, share equipment, combine expertise across disciplinary boundaries. In this way, resistance fosters community. Shared adversity builds networks grounded in mutual respect. Public misunderstanding, too, can evolve. As more voices clarify findings, as education spreads, as real-world applications demonstrate value, public opinion shifts. What once seemed radical becomes accepted, and the memory of resistance fades into totes. But during the period of backlash, the experience feels immediate. Letters questioning integrity. Emails expressing confusion or anger. Institutional reviews scrutinizing methods. In these moments, quiet courage means focusing on the work, not reacting impulsively, not engaging in unnecessary conflict, but continuing to gather evidence, continuing to refine explanation, continuing to demonstrate integrity. There is emotional maturity in this stance. It recognizes that resistance often arises from fear of change, not malice. It seeks to reduce fear through clarity rather than escalate tension. Some discoveries face decades of resistance. Generations of researchers may contribute incremental support before full acceptance occurs. The original thinker may not live to see widespread validation, yet their quiet courage laid foundation. Opposition from peers, funding struggles, public misunderstanding. These are not signs of failure. They're signs that an idea is powerful enough to matter. Trivial ideas rarely face resistance. Only those that challenge assumptions create friction, and friction, though uncomfortable, generates momentum. Risk and resistance shape the character of discovery. They test commitment. They refine communication. They demand patience. In the end, quiet courage proves more enduring than confrontation. Confrontation may win attention quickly, but it can harden opposition. Quiet courage builds slowly. It persuades through evidence. It softens resistance through consistency. It transforms skepticism into respect. And when recognition finally arrives, when peers acknowledge validity, when funding stabilizes, when the public understands, the journey through resistance becomes part of the story, not as drama, but as proof of resilience. The discovery stands stronger because it survived scrutiny. The researchers stand tied steadier because they endured doubt. And the world, often unaware of the quiet battles fought in meeting rooms and laboratories, benefits from the persistence that never sought applause. Only truth. Not every breakthrough announces itself with noise. There is rarely a dramatic chord in the background, no sudden spotlight, no immediate understanding that history has shifted. More often, the turning point arrives quietly. It enters a room already heavy with repetition, with notebooks filled, with attempts made and remade, with data points lined in careful rows. The researcher does not know at first that this moment is different from the others. The room looks the same as it did yesterday. A desk scattered with papers, a chalkboard layered with half-erased equations, glassware arranged with methodical precision, the faint scent of metal or ink or something recently heated. The hum of a small machine continuing its steady rhythm. Outside the window, perhaps, late afternoon light filters through dust suspended in the air, or perhaps it is early morning, and the world beyond the glass is still gray and quiet. The air feels ordinary. And yet, something shifts. It begins with a pattern noticed, not forced, not hunted aggressively, just observed. The scientist leans closer to the data. Rows of numbers that have been seen before, graphs that once seemed chaotic. This time the eye lingers differently. A subtle alignment appears, a curve that repeats its shape across separate trials, a deviation that is not random but consistent, not because the world has changed but because attention has narrowed. Sound recedes to the edges of awareness. The ticking clock becomes distant. The hum of equipment fades into background texture. The mind begins to trace the pattern carefully. Is it coincidence? The scientist adjusts the paper, perhaps TI, lets it toward the light, runs a finger along the line, compares it with previous trials. There it is again, a similar rise, a similar dip, a consistent interval. The heart rate may increase slightly, but outwardly nothing dramatic occurs. No raised voice, no exclamation. Only a quiet inhale. A pattern noticed is fragile. It must be treated gently. Jumping to conclusions could fracture it. The scientists resist the urge to declare discovery prematurely. Instead, they test it. Another dataset is pulled from the stack. Another trial examined. The numbers fall into place with similar rhythm. Stillness deepens. The air in the room feels thicker now, though unchanged. The weight of possibility settles quietly. A pattern noticed is the first hint. Then comes the result repeated. Repetition is the language of certainty in science. A single successful outcome means little. A repeated outcome begins to speak. The experiment is set up again. Hands move with practiced care. Instruments calibrated precisely. Conditions measured. Variables controlled. The scientist has done this dozens of times before. But this time, there is an undercurrent of anticipation. The process unfolds slowly. Liquids mixed. Switches turned. Timers set. The room waits. Perhaps there is a soft bubbling in a flask, a faint glow from an indicator light, the steady ticking of a clock, marking seconds that feel longer than usual. The result begins to emerge. A measurement aligns with expectation. A reading stabilizes exactly where the pattern predicted. The scientist watches carefully, resisting excitement. 1 repetition is promising. 2 suggest structure. 3 begin to confirm. The experiment is run again and again. Each time the same outcome appears, not identical in every minor fluctuation, but aligned in the essential way. The repetition is quiet proof. In this moment, the rang point crystallizes. It is not loud. It is not cinematic. It is a subtle internal shift from uncertainty toward belief. The calculation confirmed follows closely. Equations once tentative now feel anchored. The scientist returns to the chalkboard or notebook, rewrites the formula slowly, checks each variable, ensures no hidden assumption remains. The calculation balances. The numbers settle into coherence. The room feels different now, though nothing visible has changed. The same desk, the same air, the same late hour, but inside the mind, a threshold has been crossed. There is a pause, a moment suspended between doubt and understanding. The scientist leans back slightly in the chair, eyes fixed not on the data, but somewhere beyond it. The mind replaying each step, searching for error, testing the logic internally. Silence presses gently against the walls. In that silence, realization unfolds, not explosively, but like dawn light spreading gradually across a landscape. The pieces fit. The anomaly that once resisted explanation now integrates smoothly into a broader framework. The pattern that seemed accidental reveals structure. The repeated result confirms reliability. To calculation holds, there may be a small smile, or simply a long exhale. A whisper, perhaps barely audible. Perhaps, this is it. But even then, caution remains. The scientist knows that turning points can deceive. That confirmation bias lurks quietly. That additional verification will be required. Still, something fundamental has shifted. The work will never look the same again. The long months of confusion narrow into clarity. The data, once overwhelming, now form a coherent story. The room, once merely functional, now feels charged with significance. The dust in the light seems suspended in a different way. Time slows. The scientist glances at the clock, surprised by the hour. How long have they been here? Outside, perhaps night has fallen unnoticed. The world continues its ordinary rhythm, unaware that within this quiet room a boundary has been crossed. The turning point moment is rarely shared immediately. It is held privately at first. There is reverence in that privacy. The scientist may close the notebook gently, walk to the window, look out at the darkened sky or the fading light. The mind continues to circle the realization, testing it from different angles. Could there be another explanation? Is there a hidden variable? The fire? The cautious instinct persists, but the core insight remains steady. A pattern noticed, a result repeated with the calculation confirmed. These are the quiet pillars of breakthrough. The emotional landscape at this point is complex. Relief mingles with excitement. Fatigue from long effort blends with renewed energy. There is also humility. The scientist recognizes that this moment rests upon countless earlier failures, that without the missteps, the pattern might never have emerged clearly. Gratitude may surface for the tools, for the prior thinkers whose work laid foundation, for the patience that sustained effort. The stillness deepens before action resumes. Soon, there will be verification, replica, and peer review, publication. But for now, there is only the quiet awareness that something has changed. The turning point moment feels intimate. It belongs to the individual before it belongs to history. In some cases, the realization arrives so subtly that its significance is recognized only later. The scientist continues working, refining data, unaware that a critical threshold has been crossed. Days or weeks later, reviewing notes, the coherence becomes undeniable. Even then, the memory of the room returns, the way the light fell across the desk, the faint hum of equipment, the stillness that pressed gently against the mind. These sensory details imprint themselves alongside intellectual clarity. Breakthroughs are born in ordinary spaces, rooms not designed for grandeur, spaces marked by repetition and patience. The air before realization is not electric with spectacle. It is dense with focus. The scientist's breathing slows. The body leans closer. There is a narrowing of attention so complete that the rest of the world recedes. In that narrowing, clarity emerges. The turning point is not a leap across a canyon. It is a small step onto solid ground after wandering through fog. The fog does not vanish instantly. It thins gradually. Contours become visible. Distance gains dimension. The scientist senses that the path forward is now defined. There is work still to do. Evidence must be expanded. Arguments strengthened. Communication refined. But the core uncertainty has dissolved. This dissolution is quiet triumph. It does not require applause. It requires acknowledgement. The notebook is marked carefully, a date written in the margin, a note underlined. Later, others will read these pages. They may see only numbers and formulas. They will not feel the stillness of the room. The weight of doubt lifting, the slow spread, ebb of realization. But that moment remains foundational. Every breakthrough contains such a turning point. Sometimes it occurs in solitude, sometimes in collaboration with 2 or 3 minds recognizing the same pattern simultaneously, a shared glance across a lab bench, a collective pause before words form. Even in shared realization, the stillness holds. There is a mutual understanding that something significant has happened. Voices remain quiet, because the gravity of insight demands respect. The air before realization is not empty. It is full of anticipation shaped by effort. It carries the residue of every failed attempt. It holds the tension between skepticism and belief. When realization settles fully, it does so gently. Not as a thunderclap. The pattern fits. The result repeats. The calculation confirms. And in that alignment, the turning point becomes irreversible. The scientist will carry this moment forward into every future step. Through resistance, through scrutiny, through recognition, but no external validation will match the intimacy of that first quiet realization, in the stillness of a small room, in the ordinary air of late evening or early morning, with dust suspended in slanted light, with papers scattered in familiar disarray. A boundary was crossed, and the world, though unaware, began to change. From a distance, discovery looks luminous. A breakthrough framed in headlines, a name etched into textbooks, a photograph taken at a podium beneath bright lights. But in real time, science is rarely glamorous. It unfolds in long hours, in quiet rooms, in budgets stretched thin, in relationships tested by absence, in choices that weigh heavily on conscience. The human cost of discovery is not always visible in the final story. It lives in the margins, in the toll on the body, the strain on the hitch, art, the uncertainty of livelihood, and the burden of responsibility. Health strain is often the first quiet sacrifice. Scientific work demands patience, and patience demands time. Experiments do not always align with healthy schedules. Observations may require monitoring through the night. Data collection may stretch into early morning hours. Deadlines for grants and publications compress rest into smaller and smaller spaces. The body keeps track. Sleep shortens, meals are skipped or taken hurriedly beside lab benches. Coffee replaces water. Shoulders tighten from long hours bent over notebooks or microscopes. Eyes strain against dim light or glowing screens. There is a particular fatigue that comes from sustained mental concentration. It is not the fatigue of physical exertion, but the exhaustion of constant analysis. The mind remains active long after the body wishes to rest. Even at home, thoughts drift back to the lab, to the unresolved anomaly, to the variable that refuses to stabilize. Stress accumulates quietly, deadlines approach, funding decisions loom, peer review comments demand revisions. The weight of expectation presses inward. Peer review comments demand revisions. The immune system weakens under prolonged tension. Minor illnesses linger. Headaches become familiar companions. Some scientists ignore these signals, convinced that persistence requires endurance at all costs. Others attempt balance but find the equilibrium fragile. The drive to continue often outweighs the instinct to pause. There is irony in this. Those who seek to understand life, its chemistry, its structure, its mechanics, sometimes neglect their own. Family distance is another subtle sacrifice. The work often follows the scientist home, not physically but mentally. Conversations at dinner drift toward unfinished experiments. Weekend plans are interrupted by sudden inspiration or urgent revisions. Even when pre-net, attention may be divided. Partners learn to recognize the faraway look in the eyes, the mind revisiting data mid-conversation. Children may sense the tension that accompanies looming deadlines. Birthdays and anniversaries occasionally yield to conferences or field work. There is no dramatic declaration of neglect, only small absences that accumulate. A missed recital because an experiment reached a critical stage. A canceled vacation due to funding uncertainty. Late nights that turn into early mornings while family sleeps. Love remains, but time becomes strained. The scientist may feel guilt, yet also feel compelled. The work seems urgent, meaningful, necessary. Balancing devotion to inquiry with devotion to family becomes a delicate negotiation. Some families adapt, finding pride in the mission. Others struggle with the unpredictability. The uncertainty of outcomes can weigh heavily, not only intellectually, but emotionally. Financial hardship often threads through the early and middle stages of scientific careers. Before grants stabilize, before recognition brings security, there are years of modest salaries, temporary positions, contracts that expire without guarantee of renewal. Funding cycles dictate rhythm. A rejected proposal may mean downsizing a project, letting go of assistance, postponing purchases of essential equipment. Savings are stretched thin during lean years. Personal investments made in research materials, travel to conferences funded partly from personal accounts in hope of visibility and connection. The decision to pursue science rarely stems from pursuit of wealth, yet financial strain tests resolve. Watching peers in other professions advance more quickly in income can provoke quiet reflection. The scientist reassures themselves that fulfillment lies elsewhere, in discovery, in contribution, in curiosity. Still, bills arrive consistently. Rent or mortgage payments do not pause for inspiration. Some take on additional teaching loads to supplement income. Others consult privately. Each added responsibility consumes time that could be spent on research. The financial dimension adds another layer of stress. There's courage in continuing despite uncertainty, and investing years into work that may not yield immediate return, in accepting modest living conditions to preserve intellectual freedom. Ethical dilemmas form perhaps the most complex layer of human cost. Discovery can illuminate powerful truths that influence policy, medicine, technology. The weight of such influence rests heavily on those who uncover it. A medical researcher may confront data suggesting a treatment carries unforeseen risks. Publishing that finding could jeopardize partnerships or funding. Withholding it would protect relationships but endanger patients. A physicist may realize that theoretical insights have military applications. The line between knowledge and weapon becomes blurred. A biologist may uncover genetic information that raises questions about privacy, consent, and societal impact. These are not abstract puzzles. They are lived tensions. The scientist must decide not only what is true, but what is right. Ethical reflection often occurs in solitude. Late nights revisiting not just data, but consequences. Imagining the ripple effects of publication. Considering who benefits, who may be harmed. There is no perfect clarity in these moments. Only best judgment guided by integrity. Sometimes ethical choices require personal sacrifice. Refusing funding from sources whose goals conflict with one's values. Publishing findings that challenge powerful institutions. Resigning from positions that demand compromise. These decisions may slow career progression. They may reduce financial stability, but they preserve conscience. Science in real time does not resemble polished narratives. It is messy. It includes failed experiments that drain morale, arguments among collaborators about interpretation, revisions that stretch into the early hours, equipment breakdowns that stall progress. It includes the quiet frustration of being misunderstood, the ache of strained relationships, The anxiety of uncertain funding. There are days when the weight feels heavy, when the scientist questions the cost, wonders whether a simpler path would have been wiser. But then there are moments, small and quiet, when clarity returns. A pattern emerges. A student grasps a concept, a paper is accepted, a pair acknowledges the rigor of the work. These moments provide renewal. Health strain, if ignored too long, demands attention. Some learn to adjust, to schedule rest intentionally, to incorporate walks between experiments, to eat meals away from the lab bench, to protect sleep as fiercely as data. Balance is rarely perfect, but awareness grows over time. Family distance can also be repaired through intentional presence, through carving out time free from distraction, through sharing the meaning of the work with loved ones so they feel included rather than sidelined. Financial hardship often eases with persistence. Grants eventually stabilize. Positions become permanent. Recognition grows. But the early years remain formative. Ethical dilemmas rarely vanish. They evolve with new discoveries, with emerging technologies, with shifting societal contexts. The human cost of science is ongoing. Yet despite these sacrifices, many continue. YID. Because beneath the strain lies purpose, the desire to understand, to contribute, to illuminate. Science is rarely glamorous in real time, but it is deeply meaningful. It demands endurance. It asks for patience in the face of slow progress. Tests relationships and finances. It confronts conscience with difficult questions, and through it all, the scientist persists, not for applause, but for clarity. It tempers romanticized visions of discovery. It reminds us that every breakthrough carries unseen effort. Behind each published paper are hours of revision and doubt. Behind each celebrated finding are years of quiet sacrifice. Health strain leaves subtle marks. Graying hair, tired eyes, a posture shaped by long hours of focus. Family distance leaves emotional echoes. Missed moments remembered later with mixed pride and regret. Financial hardship leaves memories of careful budgeting, of shared apartments, of furniture assembled from necessity rather than choice. Ethical dilemmas leave reflection, conversations revisited internally, decisions weighed repeatedly. And yet, there is resilience. The human spirit adapts. Scientists learn to protect their well-being better over time, to involve family in the journey, to advocate for fair funding structures, to cultivate ethical frameworks collectively rather than alone. Science becomes not just individual pursuit, but community effort. Support networks form among peers who understand the strain. Mentors guide younger researchers through difficult choices. Institutions evolve to provide better safeguards. The glamour seen from afar fades into something more grounded. Real science is sustained effort. It is commitment that endures beyond fatigue. It is courage that faces financial uncertainty without surrender. It is conscience that refuses easy compromise. The human cost is real, but so is the human reward. The satisfaction of solving a complex problem. The gratitude of patients helped by medical advances. The wonder of understanding a small piece of the universe more clearly. These rewards do not erase sacrifice. They coexist with it. Science in real time is a long conversation between curiosity and cost, between ambition and limitation, between discovery and responsibility. And those who choose to walk this path do so, knowing that the road is not paved with glamour, it is paved with persistence, with quiet mornings after sleepless nights, with careful budgeting and careful reflection, with love tested but not extinguished, with ethical lines drawn carefully in shifting terrain. In the end, the human cost becomes part of the fabric of discovery, not as tragedy, a reminder that progress is carried forward by people, imperfect, devoted, vulnerable, who give more than is often seen. And though the spotlight eventually shines on results, the real story lives in the unseen hours, in the strain endured, in the sacrifices made, in the quiet determination that continues, even when no one is watching. Most discoveries do not begin with grand ambition to change the world. They begin small. A modest experiment on a cluttered table, a curious observation recorded in a narrow notebook, a calculation scribbled in the margin of a page. At the time, the work feels contained, limited to the room, the apparatus, the mind of the person studying it. And yet, history has shown again and again that small experiments can ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. The transformation rarely announces itself immediately. It unfolds quietly, threading into daily life so seamlessly that later generations cannot imagine a world without it. Consider medicine. In its early stages, modern medical science grew not from vast hospitals or global pharmaceutical industries, but from careful observation, a physician noticing that certain practices reduced infection, a researcher peering through a microscope at organisms too small to see with the naked eye, a chemist experimenting with compounds that altered the course of disease in laboratory conditions. At the time, these were localized efforts. A hand-washing protocol tested in a single ward, a bacterial culture studied in isolation. A new compound trialed cautiously. The results may have seemed narrow. A lower mortality rate in one hospital, a clearer image under magnification, a modest improvement in patient recovery. But from these beginnings grew entire systems. Antibiotics reshaped life expectancy. Vaccination programs altered the trajectory of epidemics. Sterile surgical techniques transformed once lethal procedures into routine operations. Today, daily life reflects these shifts in ways that feel almost invisible. Invisible. A child receives immunizations without fear of diseases that once defined entire generations. A routine surgery allows someone to return home the same week rather than face fatal complications. A minor infection treated with a short course of medication prevents prolonged suffering. These outcomes trace back to experiments conducted in rooms far removed from public awareness. Electricity followed a similar path. In its early exploration, electricity was a curiosity, sparks drawn from friction, static charges observed with fascination. Controlled discharges studied cautiously. Few could have imagined the grid of light that would one day stretch across continents. Early experiments with circuits and currents were fragile. Wires overheated. Insulation failed. Light bulbs burned out quickly. Researchers adjusted materials, measured resistance, refined voltage. The changes were incremental. A filament lasting slightly longer, a current flowing more steadily, a generator producing more reliable output. No single moment declared, "This will transform cities," and yet it did. Electric light extended productive hours beyond sunset. Homes grew safer without open flames. Factories operated with greater consistency. Refrigeration preserved food. Elevators reshaped architecture. Daily life reorganized around the availability of reliable power. The simple act of flipping a switch became so ordinary that its origins faded from memory. Communication, too, began modestly. Early experiments with telegraphy involved wires stretched between short distances, messages transmitted in coded pulses, demonstrations that signals could travel farther than voice alone. At first, this was novelty, a proof of concept, but refinement continued. Signals strengthened, transmission speed increased, networks expanded, and telephone followed, an attempt to carry voice across distance. Early devices were imperfect, sound distorted, connections unreliable. Researchers adjusted components carefully, amplified signals, reduced interference. From these small adjustments emerged a world in which distance shrank. Families separated by miles could speak directly. Businesses coordinated across cities. News traveled faster than physical transport. The evolution did not stop. Radio waves transmitted without wires. Television carried images. Digital signals encoded vast amounts of information. Satellites relayed data globally. Now daily life unfolds within a web of communication so dense that silence feels unusual. Messages arrive instantly. Video conversations bridge continents. News updates stream continuously. And all of it traces back to experiments once conducted with limited expectation. Space exploration perhaps illustrates the principle most vividly. The first calculations of rocketry were theoretical. Paper designs, mathematical predictions that a projectile could escape Earth's gravity if propelled with sufficient force. Early tests were small. Rockets barely clearing the ground, engines misfiring. Trajectories unstable. The atmosphere seemed insurmountable. But engineers persisted, improving fuel mixtures, strengthening materials, refining guidance systems. Each launch extended altitude slightly. Each failure informed redesign. Eventually, the boundary of atmosphere was crossed. Satellites orbited quietly above. Probes traveled beyond the moon. Humans set foot on extraterrestrial surfaces. The daily life impact of space exploration is often overlooked. Weather forecasting depends on orbital instruments. Global positioning systems guide navigation. Satellite communication supports internet and television. Even mundane activities. Ordering food, tracking shipments, mapping directions, rely on infrastructure born from early rocket experiments. Industry has been reshaped by scientific discoveries in subtle yet profound ways. Early studies of materials science examined the properties of metals and polymers under controlled conditions. Researchers tested tensile strength, observed reactions to heat and pressure. At first, these insights seemed limited to manufacturing processes, but stronger alloys enabled safer transportation. Lighter materials allowed more efficient vehicles. Synthetic polymers revolutionized packaging, clothing, medicine. Industrial chemistry developed fertilizers that increased crop yields. Agricultural experiments improved soil management. Food production expanded to support growing populations. Factory automation, once a curiosity involving simple mechanical repetition, evolved into complex systems guided by precise engineering principles. The quiet experiment in a lab testing machine efficiency contributed to assembly lines that redefined productivity. In daily life, this manifests as abundance. Groceries available year-round. Consumer goods produced at scale. Transportation networks operating with reliability. The cumulative effect of small experiments is staggering. Yet at the moment of experimentation, the scale remains unseen. A researcher measuring microbial growth cannot fully envision global vaccination campaigns. An engineer refining filament composition does not yet see skyscrapers illuminated against night skies. This gap between intention and impact is profound. It reveals something about the nature of discovery. Scientists pursue understanding within narrow boundaries. They ask focused questions. They test specific hypotheses. The broader consequences emerge gradually. Impact beyond imagination often arrives, not as sudden revolution, but as integration. Technology seeps into routines. Medicine becomes preventative rather than reactive. Communication tools shift from novelty to necessity. The transformation is quiet. A generation grows up unaware that life was once different. There is humility in recognizing this. The pioneers did not possess prophetic vision. They did not foresee every application. They followed curiosity, tested ideas, adjusted methods, trusted that understanding mattered, even if immediate utility was unclear. Consider the role of electricity in industry. Early experiments with electricity fields were abstract. Studies of induction, resistance, and current flow felt theoretically. But industrial machinery soon relied on electric motors. Production lines increased speed and precision. Manual labor shifted toward machine supervision. This reshaped employment, urban development, and economic structures. Cities expanded around power grids. Workdays aligned with artificial light. Transportation systems electrified. Daily life became intertwined with invisible currents. Medicine's small steps also altered family structures and longevity. Reduced infant mortality allowed populations to stabilize. Chronic diseases became manageable rather than fatal. Lifespans extended, reshaping retirement and generational relationships. Space exploration influenced not only technology but perspective. Images of Earth from orbit altered environmental awareness. Seeing the planet as a fragile sphere suspended in darkness inspired movements toward conservation. Communication advancements changed social interaction. Letters once taking weeks were replaced by instant messages. Global collaboration accelerated. Cultural exchange intensified. Cultural exchange intensified. Industry innovations influenced design, comfort, and safety. Homes insulated more effectively. Vehicles equipped with advanced braking systems. Clothing engineered for durability and performance. The quiet shaping of daily life rarely feels dramatic. It feels normal. That is perhaps the most extraordinary aspect. What was once radical becomes routine. What was once doubted becomes routine. What was once doubted becomes indispensable. One experiment informs another. One refinement enables the next. One discovery unlocks new questions. The chain extends across decades and disciplines. And at its foundation are individuals working without certainty of outcome. Testing small ideas, repeating modest trials, confirming subtle calculations. Daily life in its current form is a tapestry woven from these threads. Light at the flip of a switch. Medicine accessible within minutes. Vehicles navigating with satellite precision. Factories producing complex goods efficiently. These realities feel stable, but they are the cumulative result of countless fragile beginnings. There is quiet gratitude in recognizing this lineage. The small experiment that seemed inconsequential. The pattern noticed in isolation. The result repeated patiently. The calculation confirmed with care. From these humble moments arose transformations beyond imagination. Science rarely declares its future impact. It proceeds step by step, and the world changes quietly in response. Nations are often described through their landscapes, their politics, their monuments, or their wars. But beneath those visible markers, there is something quieter that shapes a culture over time, a habit of mind, a pattern of thought, a way of responding to uncertainty. In the story of American scientific development, one such habit has persisted gently across centuries. Curiosity, paired with courage. Not loud courage, not the kind that demands attention, but the quieter version. The willingness to ask questions when answers are incomplete. The steadiness to explore when outcomes are uncertain. The patience to experiment without immediate reward. From small workshops to sprawling laboratories. From frontier fields to urban universities. Curiosity has moved quietly through generations. It has not always been celebrated in its earliest stages. It has often looked impractical, stubborn, or idealistic. Yet over time, it has become part of the national rhythm. In a young country shaped by expansion and reinvention, questioning became less threatening and more expected. Landscapes invited exploration, resources demanded understanding, distance required innovation. The unfamiliar did not always provoke retreat. Often it provoked inquiry. What lies beyond that river? How does this soil behave? Why does this illness spread here but not there? Fiverr and Ask. The act of asking was not limited to laboratories. It was woven into daily survival. Curiosity was not abstract. It was practical. It shaped agriculture, navigation, engineering, medicine. Over time, this habit of questioning deepened. Institutions formed to support it. Universities dedicated to research. Grants designed to fund exploration without guaranteed return. Networks built to connect minds across states and disciplines. Courage became embedded, not only in individual personalities but in systems that protected inquiry. There were periods of resistance, of course, moments when fear overshadowed openness, times when political or social pressures constrained scientific thought, yet the underlying current of curiosity remained. In garages where inventors assembled early prototypes, in observatories where astronomers traced the slow movement of stars. Curiosity, as a national identity, does not mean uniform agreement. It does not imply absence of conflict. It suggests something subtler, a cultural tolerance for questioning, the courage to revise understanding, the humility to admit error. Over decades, this pattern strengthened. Scientific culture in America began to reflect not only intellectual rigor, but a certain openness to risk in funding ideas that seemed unlikely, risk in supporting research whose applications were not yet clear. risk in allowing unconventional thinkers space to work. This willingness did not eliminate hardship, it did not guarantee success, but it created fertile ground for exploration. The image of the lone scientist in a lab is only part of the story. Surrounding that individual is a culture that, at its best, values inquiry over comfort, that recognizes progress often begins with doubt. Curiosity became less an isolated trait and more a shared expectation. Children encouraged to ask why. Students challenged to test assumptions. Researchers supported, even when their work defied immediate practicality. This cultural posture shaped medicine, electricity, communication, industry, space exploration. Each born from small questions nurtured within an environment that did not immediately silence them. But curiosity alone is not enough. Curiosity without courage hesitates. Courage without curiosity risks rigidity. Together they create momentum. Courage allows the question to be voiced publicly. Curiosity sustains the pursuit when answers resist. In American scientific culture, this pairing has often surfaced during moments of uncertainty. When new diseases emerged, researchers did not retreat from complexity. They confronted it with investigation. When technological limits appeared firm, engineers tested those limits carefully, rather than accept them as permanent. When communication seemed constrained by distance, innovators imagined signals traveling invisibly through air and space. These impulses were not unique to one nation, nor confined to one era. Curiosity and courage are human traits, yet the cultivation of them within a particular cultural framework gives them distinct shape. Over time, they became stories told in classrooms, narratives of persistence, accounts of failures preceding breakthroughs, tales of skepticism overcome not by force, but by evidence. These stories reinforced identity. They whispered to new generations, ask. They suggested gently, explore. They implied quietly, do not fear the unknown. But identity is not fixed. It must be renewed. Curiosity as a national trait survives only if individuals continue to practice it. And here the story circles back, not to institutions or policies, but to the listener. Curiosity still lives in quiet minds, not only in grand laboratories or public institutions, but in ordinary spaces. In bedrooms where someone reads about distant galaxies. In kitchens where small experiments unfold. In conversations where someone wonders aloud about how something works. Courage still begins with a question. Not a declaration, not a confrontation. Just a simple, honest inquiry. What if? Why not? How might this be different? The future of any scientific culture depends less on monuments to past achievement and more on the willingness of individuals to remain curious. To resist the comfort of easy answers, to allow doubt to become doorway rather than obstacle. There is something profoundly democratic about curiosity. It does not require status. It does not demand permission. It begins privately. A thought stirring quietly in the mind. In a world saturated with information, curiosity becomes even more vital. The temptation to accept headlines without depth is strong. The speed of communication encourages quick judgment. Yet the scientific spirit asks for slowness, for reflection, for testing before concluding. In this way, curiosity remains both personal and collective. It shapes conversations. It influences education. It informs civic decision-making. And it begins in moments of stillness, perhaps late at night, perhaps early in the morning, when the world feels quiet enough for questions to surface without interruption. You do not need a laboratory to participate in this tradition. You do not need funding or formal recognition. You need only the willingness to notice something unresolved, to sit with it gently, to follow it where it leads. Curiosity does not guarantee discovery, but it keeps possibility alive. Courage does not eliminate doubt, but it prevents doubt from becoming paralysis. Together, they form a quiet current that has shaped not only scientific breakthroughs but cultural resilience. They encourage adaptability. They support innovation. They invite humility in the face of complexity. as you reflect on the long arc of discovery. From small experiments to massive change, you may notice that the story never truly belongs to institutions alone. It belongs to individuals who asked questions when silence would have been easier. It belongs to those who endured uncertainty without surrender. It belongs to minds willing to remain open. Curiosity as a national identity is not a static achievement. It is a living practice. It depends on classrooms where questions are welcomed, on conversations where disagreement remains respectful, on communities that value evidence over assumption. But it also depends on you, on whether you allow your own questions to surface, on whether you permit yourself to wonder about ordinary things, on whether you treat uncertainty as invitation rather than threat. The world still holds mysteries in medicine, in energy, in communication, in the vastness beyond Earth, in the intricacies of industry and environment. And somewhere, perhaps quietly, someone is noticing a pattern, repeating a result, confirming a calculation. The cycle continues, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. Curiosity still lives in quiet minds. Courage still begins with a question. And perhaps tonight, in the calm space between certainty and possibility, you may feel that gentle stirring within yourself. Not urgency, not pressure. Just a soft awareness that there is more to understand, more to explore, more to ask, and that the simple act of wondering is itself part of a much larger story. One that moves forward quietly, carried by those willing to look a little closer, and asks, gently tways, what if? And so, as we step away from laboratories, from long nights, from quiet turning points and unseen sacrifices, what remains is something simple: curiosity. Not loud, not restless, just a gentle willingness to wonder, and courage. Not dramatic, not defiant, just the quiet strength to ask a question and follow it patiently. These forces have shaped discoveries, reshaped nations, and quietly transformed daily life. But tonight there is nothing you need to solve. No experiment to repeat. No calculation to confirm. Let your mind rest. Breathe slowly. The world will continue turning. The stars will remain in their silent patterns. The light will still glow when morning comes. For now, you can simply close your eyes and allow yourself to rest.